Hey everyone, welcome back to NailNovice. Acrylic ratio. We've all seen the pictures of what acrylic beads look like when they're too wet, too dry, and just right, but how do we actually achieve the perfect ratio? I'm going to talk you through this today. A correct acrylic ratio has got to be the most important factor in acrylic application, and if you are experiencing anything more than minimal to zero lifting, either you aren't adequately prepping the nail, or more than likely your acrylic ratio is not quite right yet. So first let's talk about how the perfect ratio bead behaves so you know what you're looking for when you're practicing. The perfect bead will absorb all the powder on the brush within 3 to 4 seconds after pickup. Then the acrylic goes through a dimply orange peel-like state before turning glossy and smooth, and as soon as this gloss happens, this is the point that you place the bead on the nail. Not directly after picking it up from the container, it needs a few seconds to go through this 3-step process. Once placed, the bead will slightly settle within the first 4 seconds, and at around the 15-second mark, it's completely finished its settling process. If you're practicing on a plastic sheet and your bead immediately runs and flattens within just seconds, it's too wet, and you'll also notice a ring of liquid around that bead. Now you'll also notice that after placing a wet bead, after slightly curing, you're going to feel an intense heat coming off that bead. This is a huge indicator that your beads are too wet. And if your client ever comments that the acrylic is feeling hot on their nail plates, you're most definitely working too wet. Likewise, if you place your bead and it's still powdery or not budging at all, it's too dry. Often these beads will appear lumpy or have white clumps of acrylic because there wasn't enough liquid to dissolve the powder. The perfect bead will also leave the brush smoothly with minimal effort and minimal residue on your brush. A wet bead will release, but half the bead will cling to the tips of your bristles and produce a gummy mess. A dry bead normally doesn't want to release at all. It requires a lot of encouragement and leaves clumpy, powdery bits behind. Now, acrylic sticks to acrylic, so if your brush is gummy or powdery, you're going to have trouble with every subsequent bead after that releasing from your brush unless it's cleaned properly and you start fresh. So that's how beads behave. You now know what you want to see, what you don't want to see, but how do you achieve it? The more liquid, the bigger the bead. The lower the angle of your brush, the bigger the bead. I have a number 8 brush here. I'm going to burp my brush to remove all the bubbles and air from the bristles. I want a large bead, so I'm going to burp my brush and wipe on my dapping dish the entire length of my brush. I'm then going to hold my brush at a low angle and drag for a quick 1, 2, 3. I wait for the bead to go glossy, place it down and wipe my brush. I now want a medium bead. I'm going to burp my brush, wipe on my dapping dish the entire length of the brush and another half length of the brush. I'm going to hold my brush at a 45-degree angle this time and drag for a quick 1, 2, 3. Wait for the bead to go glossy, place it down and wipe my brush. Lastly, I want a small bead. I'm going to burp my brush, wipe on my dapping dish the entire length of my brush and the entire length again to remove even more liquid. I'm now holding my brush at a high angle and drag for a quick 1, 2, 3. Wait for the bead to go glossy, place it down and wipe my brush. The bigger the bead, the less liquid I removed. The smaller the bead, the higher I angled my brush up. And you can see the drag marks in the powder. The brush had the same time in the powder each bead, but the drag marks appear as different lengths because the lower the angle, the more powder my brush was able to collect in that time frame. Now, if you're working with a larger brush, your small bead following this method may still be too big for a client's teeny tiny pinky nail. So you will need to sit down and work out how much liquid you need to remove from your brush to create the size of beads you like to work with. But now that you know the behaviour you're looking for from your practice beads, hopefully this will now be easier. This is also not completely fail-safe because salon temperature plays a huge role. You may need to adjust your ratio in summer compared to winter. Plastic sheets are great to practice on because you can simply bend them and your practice beads will smoothly pop off. I recommend practicing with a clear or translucent powder, and once set, hold these up to the light. Because if your practice beads have lots of tiny bubbles in them, this indicates that your ratio is not quite right just yet. When it comes to applying your beads to an extension edge on your client, you want a slightly drier bead. The drier the bead, the stronger it is, but dry beads do not adhere as well. So we like a drier bead at the extension edge that wears the brunt of everyday life, and a wetter bead at the cuticle edge for the best adhesion to the nail plate. To achieve my extension edge bead, I first collect a perfect ratio bead, and just before it goes glossy, I'm going to bleed any excess liquid from my brush so it stays at that consistency before placing it down. For subsequent beads, I'm picking up my perfect ratio bead, allowing it to go glossy, and placing straight onto the nail without bleeding any liquid. I hope this helped to explain acrylic ratio. It's definitely one of the hardest things to master, but the most important. Please let me know in the comments below if this has helped you in your acrylic journey, and I'll be back next video.